Story 1. This story is from my grandpa. He's a retired long-distance truck driver, and he often drove throughout the night and early hours of the morning over unfamiliar roads. This one particular day, when my grandpa was in his 30s, it was between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., and he was driving down a twisting country road that was so narrow that only one vehicle could fit at a time. So if two vehicles met from different directions, one would have to pull off the road to let the other pass. The road was empty, save for my grandpa. On the right side of the road, there was thick woodland, and on the left, open fields and a lake. There were no streetlights. The only light came from my grandpa's truck and the moon. It was pretty lonely. My granddad was going steady down the road, going a bit faster than he should. When my grandpa said this, I always took it to mean he was blazing down the road as fast as the truck could go, listening to the radio and probably not paying much attention. When he suddenly felt hands on his shoulders and a voice whispers his name in his ear, so close that he felt the breath on his skin. He recognized the voice. It belonged to his mother, who had passed away a few years previously. Naturally, this spooked my grandpa, and he instinctively hit the brakes. Seconds later, his headlights lit up a pile of 3 crashed cars that took up the entire road. My grandpa stopped just short of the wreckage, but if he hadn't braked when he did, he would have plowed straight into the cars. The occupants in the crashed cars were all severely injured, and my grandpa was able to get emergency help. Had he joined the pileup, it probably would have meant a more dire outcome for all of them. There are a number of explanations for what my grandpa heard and felt, but my grandpa truly believes it was his mother giving him a warning. Story 2. I was driving home one night from an evening work event held off-site, which meant instead of my 4-minute commute, it was the better part of an hour on a twisty, dangerous 2-lane highway known for moose and bears. It was after dusk a bit, in that it's definitely nighttime, but not pitch black kind of way. I knew where I was going, so I was zoning out and just keeping my eyes peeled for animals darting out into the road. Fairly quiet Wednesday night, a huge truck comes peeling up behind me. I figured it was a local who wasn't interested in the 90-km/h speed limit, which was common, and he would pass me and go on by. This was a big fucking truck too, at least the size of a Ford F-350, and lifted. Not anything crazy, but I live in a rural area, and big honking working pickup trucks are fairly common. So I didn't think anything of it other than it was just a local in a hurry to get somewhere. He slowed down behind me as I was doing about 100, 105, and then flashed his high beams in preparation to pass me. He sped up into the oncoming lane, came even with my car, and then paused, matching my speed for a second. There were 2 youngish guys in the truck, looking down at me in my hatchback. A lone female in her 20s, in dressy clothes, and then they slowed down and got behind me again. This had never happened to me. I was beginning to worry. I was still a half hour from my turnoff to get home, and it was pretty rural along the way. I was driving and checking my rearview mirror compulsively, and this truck just kept creeping closer and closer up to my bumper until they were tailgating me. They'd fall back a little bit, then creep up and ride my tail. I slowed down to 90, 80, and sped up to 110, 120. Still worried that a deer or moose would choose this moment to hop out in front of me, and then I'd have more problems. It didn't matter. They stuck right on my tail. We passed turnoffs. They were still there. And then they started flashing their high beams at me again and again. On, off, on, off, on, off. Stupidly, I wondered if they had seen something in my car and were trying to warn me about it. But my car had been in for a tune-up the week before, and I knew there were no lights out. I had checked it before I had gotten in because I was loading work stuff into it. And it was a hatchback. I could see everything perfectly. Then I started to wonder if they were trying to alert me of something up ahead. Basically, my mind was racing. I even wondered if they were trying to signal me something in Morse code. but it was just a constant on-off, on-off, on-off high beam dance. At one point, they turned their lights off completely, and then I definitely panicked hard. I didn't want to stop at a gas station because I didn't trust a single, solitary gas attendant to help me in the event these dudes wanted to hurt me. The nearest OPP station was still 50 minutes away. I thought about calling 911, but was afraid no cops would be nearby to help me. This was stupid. Do not be afraid to call 911. The truck was getting closer and closer to my bumper every time, until I was genuinely afraid they were going to run me off the road into the woods or a lake. At one point, I turned my radio off and cracked the window, even though it was a cold night. And when the truck came very close to my bumper, I could hear the two guys in the cab screeching and hollering. I don't know what they were doing, but it was noisy. I kept speeding up, and they kept flashing their beams, getting up to my bumper, dropping back, and coming close again like they were deliberately trying to terrify me. I live near a military base, and the main gates are on my way home. On the turnoff from the highway, they followed me. Of course they did. My only thought was that there was no way I was going home with these assholes tailing me, so I turned into the main gates. Nobody was at the main checkpoint, so I flew through it and turned down to the MP shack. The truck got to the main gates behind me and then stopped. Just stopped. They pulled through it, did a U-turn, and went absolutely flying out of those gates and back towards the highway, doing way more than 100. I got the MPs to escort me home. I don't know what was going on. I was very, very, very frightened that I was about to be run off the road and attacked, or possibly just left for dead. The MPs called me the following week to tell me they hadn't been able to find any complaints of trucks matching that description, but they would note it for the future. In the very best case scenario, it was a couple of drunk or high idiots who thought scaring someone would be a terrific way to spend an evening. In the worst case scenario, that could have been my last night on Earth. Story 3. I had just bought all the parts for a brand new badass computer and had headed over to my buddy's place to put it together because we both like that kind of thing, and it's always better to have an extra head to catch the shit you missed. It's a dark, stormy night and raining. No big, that's normal this time of year. Anyway, it takes a little longer than I expected because it's been about 4 years and tech changes fast. There were a few new things I hadn't counted on. I can't leave right away because the rain picks up. It's pretty impressively bad, so I hang out for a little bit until it slacks off so I can safely transport the new mini nuke I just built to my car without it getting all wet. I do that, then head home. My buddy lives near a river, and I have to cross a short bridge to get to the part of town he lives in. The road I take runs between 2 hills, then heads up to the high ground some 10 miles on. This is southern Ohio, so by hill, I mean small mountain, at least 200 to 300 feet high. As I cross the bridge, I think everything is cool. The river looked a little swollen, but nothing serious, just a normal fall gully washer. And there hadn't been a flash flood warning issued that night. As I cross the intersection and start heading down the road, I realize suddenly that the road is disappearing. Fast. There is a veritable wall of water rushing over it ahead of me, and I can see in my headlights that the ground normally a good 4 or 5 feet below the level of the road on all sides is gone, replaced by mud-dark water. I don't panic. Panicking is bad. It'll get you killed. This actually ran through my head. I execute a very tense, very perfect, very fast, and very tight 3-point turn. I do this because I can no longer see the road anywhere. There's just water everywhere. It's now rushing over the road from every direction I look. I know I'm taking a chance, but I gotta get the F out, and going forward isn't an option. I zoom back toward the intersection and manage to make it out of the water, but it's literally chasing me up the road. I hang a right, to head toward a road I know heads up a hill and back toward my home by another route. It's no more than 100 yards down the road. I figure that going up, away from the river's the safest bet. I'm so fucking wrong. As I reach the turn, there is a waterfall where the road is supposed to be. The downhill road has turned into what can only be described as a rapid, and it's thundering across the one I'm on, heading across it toward the river. I J-turn, thank you Army, and haul ass for the bridge, hoping that I can get across, because I'm certain now it's gonna be flooded too. I skate across it, it's fine, but the road on the other side is starting to wash out too. I punch the gas and head down another road that runs away from the river and gently up heading into farmland and away from home, but toward a highway I know is above flood level. I hit 3 more washouts on the way to the highway, but I made it fine. They weren't anything like that monster I ran into in the valley between 2 hills, but by that time, my asshole was puckered tighter than a snare drum. It took me 2 hours to get home. It normally takes 30 minutes. Story 4. I have an uncle, not really my uncle, but we call friends of our parents' uncles and aunts who, for a while, drove a delivery truck in the morning in Taipei. This was like 40 years ago. Anyway, one day he was doing his usual pre-dawn delivery when he got back into the driver's seat. There was a girl with long black hair and a gray t-shirt sort of dress sitting in the passenger seat. She was just looking down at her lap and didn't respond at all when he told her she needed to get out of the truck. She just kept looking at her lap. He thought she was like a mentally ill person. Taiwan was not particularly good with mental illness, and many of them would roam the streets. He was on a tight schedule, so he said, "Fuck it," and carried on with his deliveries with her right in the passenger seat. When he finished unloading at his last stop and got into the truck, she was gone. Okay. He thought she just went home or left or something. The same thing happens over the next 5 days. At one point or another on his deliveries, this girl would be in the passenger seat, completely silent, looking at her lap, and no matter how much he begged and asked her to get out so he could finish his deliveries, she wouldn't respond, so he would drive with her until the last delivery, at which point she'd disappear when he went in the truck again. It only stopped when one day, as he was unloading, she was supposedly in the passenger seat. At this point, he realized that she couldn't have gotten into the truck through the passenger side door, because when he stops and makes a delivery, the truck is always butted up against racks in front of the warehouses. So he puts boxes on the racks, and someone inside takes it from the rack. He locks the driver's side door out of habit, so he immediately goes to the front of the truck, but she's gone. He never sees her again. Story 5. I was with my father driving through East Bumfuck, CT, because my cousins just moved there. This town had 2 green streets, and this was back in the days of MapQuest. I imagine one was Old Green Street or something, and they never put the old up. Anyways, we turned down Green Street, and after about a mile, it turns into a dirt road, all downhill at a steady decline and raining. So we're driving along, and all we can see around us at this point is trees and the little shanty shack made out of sheet metal, barrels, plywood, etc., out of a Looney Tunes show, or The Hills Have Eyes, or an old Western or something, and some shotgun blasts. So at this point, we're a few miles into the forest on a dirt road at night, in the rain, and we can't see shit, except for trees and creepy shacks. And we've got a couple of gunshots going off every other minute. We're a bit out of our element. We get to the bottom, and there's a wooden bridge with a goddamn tree that fell through and smashed the whole thing. At this point, we turn back around toward civilization, and we're damn lucky that we were in the Range Rover, or we wouldn't have been able to get up that dirt road. We get to my aunt and uncle's place, and my cousin is just like, "Oh yeah, some of my classmates are pretty poor and live in those types of setups." Story 6. I was coming home one night from a 24-hour driving range. It's around 3 a.m. No other cars on the road. There are two stoplights and a railroad track crossing before I can turn into my neighborhood. I go through the green light at the first light and notice a minivan blow through a red light at the same intersection and get right behind me. Cross over the tracks, get in the turn lane to go into my neighborhood. The minivan is behind me. Can't make out the driver's face. Thought I was being paranoid. The light turns green and I turn into the neighborhood. Get to the first stop sign, look back, and the minivan has pulled over. Once again, figure I'm paranoid, so I keep driving. Pulling up to the next stop sign, I see the minivan is right behind me again. I decide it's time to be paranoid. I'm driving through all the back streets in my neighborhood. Every time I start to turn a corner, I see the minivan pulling around the last corner. This goes on for about 10 minutes. I finally lost the minivan. Coming back out onto the main road through the neighborhood and directly across from me, on the other side of a green belt, is the minivan. I turn and head down a circle that has a few vehicles similar to mine, pull up to the curb, cut the lights, and laid back so my tinted windows would hide me. I waited there for a couple of minutes. Right as I'm about to turn the lights back on and head home, I see the minivan in my rearview mirror. I lean back again, and as the minivan passes, I see the driver. It's a regular at my job. We'd suspected her of stalking me a few times, but it had always been a joke. Turns out it was legit. I wait a few more minutes and slowly head home. No minivan in sight. Story 7. Last summer, 2 friends of mine and myself decided to go out on a road trip through the American Southwest. We'd been traveling for 2 days and were driving the southwestern Utah, heading from Zion National Park to St. George, where one of my friends, who will be called Spencer, his grandparents lived and had offered to let us stay for the night. It had been a long day with about 8 hours of driving, having done about 6 of it and done a lot of hiking. So we were understandably exhausted and anxious to get into a nice bed, especially after the shitty hotel mattresses of the previous 2 days. We were also running really late. We had planned to arrive at around 8, but it ended up being probably 10:30 when we got to St. George. Anyway, we finally get off the highway in St. George when Spencer decides to tell my other friend Ian and me how his grandparents' house is right across the street from a graveyard. Okay, well fuck, that's spooky, especially when coming by after dark, but it's not like we have another free place to stay. So what are you gonna do? Spencer starts giving us some background on his grandparents, and we turn into the neighborhood. So while following the directions of the GPS, I see a stop sign about 50 yards away. Next to the sign, I see 3 small, human-like figures. At first, I'm like, what the fuck are those kids? They're like 7 years old. Why are they out here at 10:30 p.m. on Tuesday without parents? Don't they have school tomorrow? We get closer, my 2 friends still just talking, not paying attention, and upon closer examination, the figures were not kids, but poles to road signs. I relax. Then I start slowing down for the stop sign, and I look back at the poles, and I realize it was little kids after all. But there was something off. These kids were perfectly still, not looking at each other or talking for the entire 15 seconds or so that they'd been in my view, which given isn't entirely weird, but as we approached the stop sign, they stared into our car with the most demonic little faces I'd ever seen. None smiled, they all just looked super disappointed. I don't really know how to describe it, but the kids, who were definitely present and real, seemed somehow translucent, I guess, like they were ghosts. My friends stopped talking and noticed, which was weird. It's not like these children were particularly unique other than their odd presence at night, and I hadn't said or done anything to warrant a reaction, so they apparently were also getting the sense that something was up. The time it took to round that corner, staring these ghost children in the eyes, seemed like an eternity. As I turned right, their gaze followed us the whole way, looking through us. I shouted, "What the fuck was that?" And my friends were equally as spooked and in hysterics. A couple of seconds later, I look in the rearview window where they should have been, and they're gone. We make another right turn at the next opportunity, and there's the Mormon church and graveyard, just a block away, with Spencer's grandparents' house halfway between the spooky children's corner and the graveyard. Once I parked the car, all of us looked at each other, daring the other to go out first. Finally, Ian steps out, and we head inside sprint walking, not even bothering to take the time to get our bags out of the trunk. Spencer's grandma answers the door and lets us in, and we pretend like nothing ever happened. I know it doesn't read super spooky, but at the time, it was legitimately scary. Here's the thing. I am 95% sure that when I mistook the children for poles, they really were poles. I'm not sure what that means, but it honestly has gotten me to take a second look at the existence of the supernatural. Also, now I'm terrified of Mormon churches at night, which really sucks because the path I take home from class, which gets out at like 8 p.m., passes right in front of one. Story 8. I was driving home one night and needed to release some of the drinks I had consumed that night. Not too many to drive, though. Was about to pull over in the middle of nowhere, but there was some drunk guy hitchhiking, so I drove a bit further before pulling over. Unfortunately, he either sped up or I may have underestimated how long it would take to relieve myself because he lurched out of the darkness, scaring the crap out of me, not literally, by asking for a ride. Well, I couldn't say no since he was standing right there, so he got in the car and told me he lived close by. Clearly, that was relative because I was driving for about 10 minutes out of my way before I got to his house. During the drive, he was checking out my car and telling me all about his car, how great it was, how good it was at doing burnouts, etc. He tells me that when he gets to his house, he will show me how good at burnout it is. I was extremely skeptical. This bloke could barely stand, and yet when we got to his parents' house, which was also in the middle of nowhere, he got into the house, came back with keys, and drove up in a hotted-up Commodore. He then puts on a hair-raising circle work display worthy of summer gnats, which scared the shit out of me because he was blocking the only way out on a skinny, unlit road with big ditches on either side. I could see him either plowing into my car, falling into a ditch from which I would have to rescue him, or attracting the attention of the police, at which point we would both be arrested because my car looked like trouble too. Amazingly, after a few terrifying minutes, the party was over and I went on my way. But I still had no idea how someone so drunk could be so good at what are fairly complex maneuvers. Story 9. When I was 16, I worked the closing shift at my aunt's gas station. I usually got to leave at 10, but on this particular night, someone came in at 9:55 and stayed until 10:15, so I had to stay late to correct my mopping job that they stomped on. I take a shortcut home down a less populated road than normal so that I, in all of my youthful stupidity, can do 90 in a 45. Right after I cross this bridge on my shortcut road, I see something in my passenger seat. I turn to my right to make eye contact with this man who just looked right back at me. Then I looked at the road as he did the same and just sped up to 106 mph, trying to get to another vehicle as quickly as possible. Right around the time I come up on a four-way stop, I look again and the man is gone. Not in the passenger seat, not in the back, gone. I mention it to my coworker the next night and he starts looking a little bit more intrigued. He asks what bridge exactly I'd crossed. The road I took was named after this bridge, so he immediately knew exactly where I'd been when I answered. He asked if I remembered the funeral he talked about serving as a pallbearer on Sunday. I said yes, and he explained that his friend Chris had died in a motorcycle wreck just near that bridge the Friday before I saw the man in my car. Fast forward a year and a half, I've since seen one of those crosses people sometimes erect next to places where loved ones have wrecked in a spot next to this bridge, and the name Chris was painted on it, so either my coworker wasn't lying or he's going way too far for a joke. I sometimes take this road home, sometimes don't. Sometimes see the man in my passenger seat, sometimes don't. I notice that it only happens when I'm on this road between 10:30 and 10:45. And then once I get in a wreck of my own and have to buy a new car, it stops happening altogether. Eventually, I think about telling my mom about it. She asked for a lot of details about where I stopped seeing this man in my car. She asks if I've ever seen him again after getting the new one. After I pressed her for details, she explained that Chris was a distant relative of ours, that he knew what I drove. It was a limited edition 2-color rich white kid car that my grandpa had given me, and that the house where he lived was really close to that 4-way stop. She insisted that he was using me to catch a ride home anytime I passed his death site at the time that he was trying to pass through that night. But now I'm in college and live 100 miles away from all of that bullshit, so whatever.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.